Greetings and welcome to another lecture in comparative psychology. So here what we're going to do is we're going to finish up chapter 11. Finish up talking about foraging, at least talking about foraging in terms of it being its own chapter. Now, we've talked a lot about foraging, about the techniques that animals use. We talked about how they need to weigh these decisions. But one interesting thing is that we can look at how animals' brains have apparently adapted to the type of foraging that they do. A lot of this research has been done with birds. A lot of foraging research has been done with birds. I suspect because they need to eat a lot, and it's very easy, or it's relatively easy to keep them in captivity, and so it's easy to put them in environments in order to more or less determine exactly how it is that they are foraging. And there are some birds, for instance, that as part of their foraging, when seeds or other food are available, they take those seeds and they hide them. They cache them, it's called. And C-A-C-H-E. We're going to talk about that a lot on this slide. So they hide them. I've seen blue jays, bury acorns in the yard, or other birds, hide food elsewhere. And the thing is, for the most part, an animal that hides food also needs to remember where they put the food, because quite frankly, if they don't remember where they put it, it's not going to do them a whole lot of good. We're not sure that all animals, by the way, remember where they put their food. Squirrels, for instance, bury a lot of acorns, and they also forget to dig up a lot of acorns. Whether they simply don't get to those acorns or they have indeed forgotten where they are, we don't know. Birds have a tendency to remember these very well. And in fact, it looks like their brains have adapted in order to help them remember things. Specifically, birds that cache a lot of seeds, a lot of the jays and the corvids, the crows, and various nutcrackers, that sort of thing, they have larger hippocampi in relation to total brain size, of course. Everything tends to be in relation to brain size, because after all, smaller animals have smaller brains than larger animals do, so we always look at relationships. Well, birds that cache seeds tend to have a hippocampus that is much larger in relationship to their total brain size than other birds do. And of course, as you'll remember from general psychology, and possibly from any physiological psychology you've taken, the hippocampus is the part of the brain that's involved in memory. So therefore, it would make perfect sense for these birds to have more highly developed hippocampi in order to remember this information. What's interesting is this is not only true between species. If we compare a bird that caches a lot of nuts between birds that don't cache, yes, we're going to see a difference in the relative size of the hippocampus. But there's also been some experiments looking at different populations of the same species. There are certain populations of species that live in areas where, the example in your book are birds that live, for instance, in Alaska versus that live more in the lower 48. And the birds that live in Alaska tend to cache a lot more food. Their food is available for a shorter period of time, and they're going to need it for longer. And it turns out that Alaskan populations of these birds actually have larger hippocampi in relationship to the rest of their brains than non-Alaskan populations do, which makes it make sense that these particular individuals then are just it's easier for them to remember because they have to. So birds with larger hippocampi have survived better and produced more offspring, and therefore they are more likely to then leave offspring that also then have larger hippocampi. Now, whenever you're talking about a brain alteration, there's always the possibility, there's the chicken and egg problem. Is it that the bird was born with a larger hippocampus and therefore it has a better memory? Or is it that the need to remember so many more different seed hiding places cause the bird to have a larger hippocampus? And it looks like for these birds that it is genetic. That if you take some birds of that Alaskan population, for instance, and you put them in, you breed them in captivity, and therefore they are in an environment where they don't have to cache seeds, those baby birds will grow up and still have a larger hippocampus in relationship to the rest of their brain than birds of the non-caching population. So it does seem to be something that birds have evolved and that birds are born with. Another thing about birds and brains is that, well, we've known for lots of species that there's a particular part of the brain that's involved in behavior, particularly involved in new behavior and creative behavior, and that would be the forebrain. The forebrain, as you can probably tell by the name, is the part of the brain that's in the front. In humans, it's pretty much right behind our eyes, right behind our foreheads. It's a forebrain. And it turns out that birds that have larger forebrains and possibly therefore have more behavioral plasticity, which basically means that they are able to have more different types of behavior. They can change their behavior. They're not ruled by the behaviors that they are born with. They can learn and acquire different behaviors, the same way you can mold plastic into almost anything. They tend to be more innovative in discovering new foraging techniques. They're more creative. They come up with more different ideas. They're more likely, if you like, to think outside of the box. And that may have to do with the fact that indeed they have a larger hippocampus. Or to be larger forebrain. And maybe hippocampus, I don't know. The hippocampus is for memory. The forebrain is for new behaviors. So they are more likely. There are some birds that have learned amazing things to get food. I think I showed you some videos of New Caledonian crows who were using tools. Other birds have also learned lots of techniques. Your book goes into some of them, into some sort of gruesome detail. But I know, for instance, that seagulls in a lot of areas have learned to crack say oysters or clam shells or snail shells. They pick the shells up and they drop them onto concrete. Now, the birds did not evolve with concrete, but the birds have lived with concrete in a lot of ways. And concrete, by the way, is much better than asphalt. Asphalt is a little springy. It has a little give to it. They don't crack as nicely on those. You drop them on concrete from, 20 or 30 feet, you are going to crack that shell. So there are some concrete parking lots by a seagull habitat, for instance, that are covered in broken clamshells because the birds have learned to do that. Not every bird has learned to do that. Not every species has learned to do that. Some of them, never learn how to crack it and therefore don't eat that kind of food or just try to figure out other ways to crack it by pecking or something. So, yes, it does appear that an individual or a species, if you were, brain can indeed affect its foraging. How it forages, what it forages for, how it saves food, how it finds food. Continuing in the whole, well, let's change, let's not go with pre-programmed behavior. Let's go with what can be learned. We do know that it's possible for members of a lot of species to learn how to forage or what to forage for by others, by watching others, learning from others, social learning. And sometimes this learning, there are definitely some techniques where this foraging is taught very deliberately. For instance, I think if I haven't shown you videos of the chimpanzees using tools to crack open nuts and stuff, they're fairly easy to find. And those are indeed learned. I talked about that in the learning chapter. But there are some that it's almost like animals learn, some cases, what roles. Your book talks about pigeons. And it divides pigeons up into two types, producers and scroungers. Lovely names, producers and scroungers. Producers basically produce food. They go out, they find food, they figure out how to get food. When I lived in New York City, for instance, it was always interesting to watch pigeons figure out or find pigeons that were basically foraging in garbage cans, where people would throw out food and the pigeons learned to go in and not only grab food they might be able to see, but some of them learned to go in and kind of rummage around in bags to find food. As did rats, but they generally came out at night and the pigeons came out during the day. So I was usually watching the pigeons during the day. Well, it turns out that basically we can divide pigeons up into two categories. We have producers that go out and find food, as I just said, and we have scroungers that hang out and eat the food that the producers have found. Which sounds a lot like conservative talking points about human beings. I in no way want to suggest that we can therefore take this information from pigeons and apply it to people. We're going to stick to the pigeons. But what's interesting is that pigeons don't appear to be born to be producers or born to be scroungers. But pigeons that have learned to be scroungers don't really learn to be producers. They're very, very bad at learning how to find food. Whether there's some kind of critical period that they need to learn to find food during that period of time, or whether they simply figure they can just hang out and wait for the producers to produce food that they can then scrounge. It's difficult to tell because, of course, we can't ask them. But we do know that pigeons apparently learned their roles here, and they learned them very well. Now, I mentioned rats earlier. Rats also learn from others. It's less about expecting others to produce food for them. You know, videos of pizza rat dragging a slice of pizza down subway stairs, to the contrary, whatever. But rats, I talked about this before when I talked about conditioned taste aversion, in that rats cannot throw up, and therefore they are very, very careful about what they eat. And one of the ways they learn about what to eat is by essentially, wait a minute. Scroungers, as I said, don't learn to find food. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. I was looking at my notes and not at the screen. I apologize. But that's okay, because you can pause it and write it down. So rats, as I mentioned before, I think I said before that mother rats will actually teach their babies what to eat and what not to eat, according to what they themselves eat. It does appear perhaps to be not deliberate, that mama rats aren't taking baby rats up to certain foods and going, no, don't eat that. But rats learn to prefer food that they smell on others. If rats have a food that they can smell on other rats, they smell it on, that the rat has been in their area, or for that matter, if it's just food that they smell in their general environment. If you pipe smells into rats and then give the rats the opportunity to eat the food that smells like that particular smell, rats will actually eat that food faster and more than they will foods that they haven't been exposed to the smell. It's almost like if they're exposed to it, they figure that it's safe. They also apparently smell other rats' breath and also their droppings or their urine to tell what it is that they should eat. Rats tend to live in very close quarters. There's no social distancing for rats. And they, smell each other all the time, and they're around each other's droppings. They certainly are smelling each other's breath, although, again, I don't think they walk up and go, exhale on me like people do if they're worried they need to go brush their teeth. But if a rat smells that another rat has eaten a food and that rat seems alive and well, then the rat that smells that is more likely to eat it if he or she runs into that food. So baby rats may learn what food to eat simply because mama rats avoid certain foods, so the baby rats learn to avoid it themselves. That's social learning. Like I said, it's not teaching, but it's learning. And it definitely plays a role in how animals figure out what foods to eat, what foods to catch, what foods to form those search images about, taking me back to the first video, and therefore what foods to consume.